Hi, everybody. Welcome to Living Open. I'm Erin, your host. This week's episode is with Jessi Huntenburg, a Philly based witch, tarot card reader, and shadow work expert I met when I went to her shadow work workshop at this amazing little store in my neighborhood, Ritual. Her workshop really opened my eyes to shadow work and what it is, why it matters, and so I had to have her come on the show, obviously. This episode is really fantastic, and I definitely recommend getting out your journal and a pen to take notes during this conversation because she really explains the importance of shadow work and exactly how to get started with it. We also talk about how she discovered a spiritual practice, what witchcraft and being a witch means to her, creating a fulfilling career as an entrepreneur, and a bunch more. I think my key takeaway from this episode was something that Jessi said near the end that just really resonated with me and kind of stopped me in my tracks. Was when she says, I find that first the shadow work journey is about what's happened to you, and then slowly but surely it transitions to a space where you realize that you are also someone's shadow. Yeah. So I will leave it there and let's get into the episode. Let me know what you think of it. I hope you love it as much as I do. And I would love it if you could just start out by kind of telling me your journey to getting to where you are. I know this is really a long question, but I'm wondering kind of how you discovered a spiritual practice and got started with tarot and shadow work and starting your own business.
Okay, I can do that.
Awesome.
So, so I actually began, spiritually speaking, within the Catholic Church when I was very, very young. And my mother had a bit of a falling out with the church. Nothing big, nothing huge. More so, she just realized that it wasn't something that was really vibing with her. So I moved from Catholic school to public school. And around the age of 13 or 14, I came out as an atheist. No,
Mm.
I'd never really, I remember beginning to question the Catholic faith at around the age of 7 and 8, because just when you have that very innocent child mind, things are very black and white and you see things that way. And for me, certain things didn't add up. Like I felt like what I was being taught was conflicting. And I was just like, well, if God created everyone and everyone are his children, why would he deny anyone in entrance into the kingdom of heaven and things like that? And I was always just thinking way too much for my own good from a very young age. And this path of reasoning and logic just led me to kind of throw out the notion of God altogether. And for a very long time, I was just pleased and happy with that. It worked for me. I always approached things very logically and rationally anyway. And really, it wasn't until I hit my mid 20s that I came upon the realization that spirituality could be something that's workable, and it doesn't necessarily need to be explained. And that's how I kind of opened myself to a spiritual path. I said to myself, if this is something that works for me and something that works for so many people, and it helps me achieve specific aims and, makes me feel good and helps me travel a path of wellness, then that can be enough. I don't need to explain it. I don't need to completely understand it. And that can be a slippery slope. People will use that, belief in order to justify certain things without any proof. But my brand of spirituality is very much my own. I'm not big on proselytizing or getting anyone to, get down with my spiritual path. I'm always to each his own. So it became a workable thing for me in order to work through some of the issues that I felt like needed to be worked through. So the brand of spirituality I practice is witchcraft. And this is one that, some will trigger some people and, it experiences some backlash. But I think there are some misconceptions around witchcraft and what it is. People will automatically think that it's, satanic path and Satan worshiping, and it's not.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not even close. And even there are those who practice Satanism. And honestly, they're much more scientific and rational than you'd expect. And they use the archetype of Satan in order to help them, work with their dark side. It's not about, sacrificing babies or or damning Christianity. I know a lot of Christian witches myself. And witchcraft and the practice of magic is something that's been that's been practiced for thousands and thousands of years through pagan religions and even within Christian religions too. And for me, really the practice of witchcraft it helps, depending on what brand you practice, it helps attune you to the natural world around you, which I feel like we have a need for right now, considering global warming and everything that's happening, and, people rising up to kind of try to protect and preserve what already exists, the good things that already exist. And it has a lot to do with conscious intention setting, at least the way that I practice it and approach it. And for me, I use archetypes and, magical practice as physical representation to try and help reprogram my brain towards a specific goal. So say I want to start my own business. What I would do is I'd start out, looking up correspondences with herbs and things, perhaps planning candle magic, using the phases of the moon to help me determine, when I'm going to perform a certain magical working. And this is all in the service of priming me and my psyche for doing the work that I want to do. And it's a process of convincing myself that I'm capable of it. So that for me is how I practice it in a more active sense. And ritual and meditation are also part of my practice, and that's my more receptive practice. That's where, shadow work comes into play. That's where self-reflection comes into play, questioning how I came to be the person that I am and how I can be a better person, given the tools that I have and the aims that I have, and how I can be a more compassionate individual. And witchcraft tends to be super eclectic. So meaning that people will pull from all different traditions and backgrounds in order to create a practice that's uniquely theirs, especially someone who practices solitary and not as part of a coven. And I am a solitary practitioner. And although you can run into questions of cultural appropriation when you pick from different religions and practices, as long as you are honoring the tradition that you are that you're pulling from, and as long as you're practicing in tune with that tradition, then it seems to be ethically sound, at least as far as I approach it. So yeah, I think I really began practicing around the age of 25, 26. And then when I had my daughter, I got really intense into practicing, because that was a whole shadow experience in and of itself. I just wanted to, make sure that I was doing right by her and, guiding her the best way that I possibly could. And it allowed me to, or it invited me to look back on, how I was parented. And then I, went down the rabbit hole in terms of like, what are my fears? What are my insecurities? How was that bred within me, and how did I perpetuate it? And all of these things, in the purpose, for the purpose of trying to be a better parent. And that's just how it kind of blossomed, the spiritual practice. And I kind of put my ego aside a little bit and decided that I was going to open up to this, because I tried so many different things to try to integrate these aspects of myself in order to be, a more self-actualized being. And I kind of gotten to that point where it kind of reminds me of, I don't remember who said this, but they're talking about revolution, and how when like what you have to risk isn't like it's worth taking the risk. Like you don't have that much else to lose at that point. So that's kind of where I got to, where I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this stuff. It might seem silly to me as I'm doing it, especially at first. I might have, some kind of identity crises in the process, being such a logical, rational person. But I opened myself to that. And honestly, it's been a wild ride. It's been incredibly transformative. I've been able to, take risks and move in directions that I've wanted to move in for a really long time, but haven't really felt that I was able to. So it just kind of, it pushed me to do the hard work that I needed to do in order to move past some blocks.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I love how you were talking about too, how you were very much in this like logical mindset of like having things make sense and like atheism, and this is just like a logical way to think about things. And you were able to open yourself up to letting this kind of magic in, and it's totally changed your life. So I'm wondering, for people who are that way as well, people who are really logical and think things need to really like make sense like that, how would you recommend they start to open themselves up to magic like you did?
So I came from, yes, a very logical background, but I've also been really open to kind of wild out there ideas about psyche and how it works, about Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. And my advice would be to take a look at first the logical things that make sense but don't make sense. For example, and I'm going to forget some certain terminologies here, there's a phenomena that occurs when a big idea or a big breakthrough will be alighted upon by two different, completely different people working independently of each other at opposite ends of the globe. And now we can't really, trace that because of the internet. But I'm talking hundreds of years ago, before there was any sort of, intercontinental communication, that happened so quickly. And there were a couple scientific discoveries that were made within days of each other. Which at opposite ends of the globe, which is super wild. And one of the reasons to explain this would be the idea of the collective unconscious, thoughts as separate entities that, like, once they're formed, live in the ether, and almost as if you yourself are a computer, you can download these thoughts because they're there for the taking. Someone else has had them, and they exist in this, massless orb, I guess you could say, that's shared amongst all of us. And that was a cool way that that I could kind of enter into it. Also, the idea of working with archetypes. So if you're someone who's atheistic or overly logical, not overly logical, if you're someone who's logical, you can begin to work with certain archetypes without having to believe in them as deities per se. So an archetype is basically a representation of a certain personality that is found across cultures. So we have God archetypes. We have the trickster archetype, like Loki, that you'll find in pantheons, all over the world. It's these ideas of personality representations that we all share and that we all have access to. And if you think of working with the archetypes themselves to see what those archetypes can teach you, it might be easier for you to enter into, a more magical or spiritual headspace, because you can make that transition. It doesn't have to be deity outside of the self. It doesn't even have to be deity that like lives within you and outside. It can just be this idea. And you're working with this idea that others have worked with, for thousands of years, and others have learned things from. We find archetypes in literature, and you can also work with archetypes that are really familiar to you. I'm one of those people. I'm not a strict deist or anything like that. I will work with literary archetypes. I'll work with popular, pop pantheons, archetypes that we find in pop culture, as long as it's useful. So you can also begin to think of this as, a conversation an internal conversation that you're having. And you can also think of things like spell work and like tarot as, a blueprint or physical representation of an archetype that can help you gain access to your subconscious and gain access to aspects of self that are more difficult for you to access in your conscious mind.
Yeah, that's great advice. Have you read the book Big Magic?
I haven't.
Okay. What you were saying about how like when one person has an idea and that discovery also happens like somewhere completely on the other side of the globe, like the same day or right around that same time. She talks about that a little bit in her book, how she had because the book's all about creativity, how she had this idea for a book. And then she met up with her friend who lives in Texas, and they hadn't talked about it at all. And this was like a couple months later. And she was asking her if she was working on anything new. And her friend was like, oh, yeah, I just started working on this book. And it was Elizabeth Gilbert's idea that she hadn't started working on. She was like, oh my God, like we had the same idea. So it just reminded me of that.
It happens a lot.
Yeah.
And I find it happens a lot too with the internet. It's almost more it's speeded up, if you will. Like I work primarily on email readings, so I'll work with people all over the place. And I have my peers, and I've had times where I've come up with this idea for a reading, I fleshed it out, I've enumerated the positions, I'm getting ready to launch it into the internet sphere, and then I notice on social media that one of my peers has had like almost the exact idea and has launched it before me. I'm like, damn it. I'm like, oh, should I still launch it, or should I go back and change it? Like see that I'm like copying these people because no one wants to rip off anyone else. It just happened. I released a reading for Mercury retrograde, or a spread for Mercury retrograde and a reading yesterday. And one of my really close peers and colleagues like ended up doing the same thing 12 hours ago. And I know she didn't whip that shit up in like 6 hours. Like she had already had that idea
Yeah.
as well. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah, it's so funny.
It's kind of wild. And when you start working with even working alongside or beside people, you influence each other so much. So like even if it's not expressly stated, like everyone is throwing their ideas into into this giant pit, and we're all plucking them, and it's just like sometimes we're plucking the same ideas, and it's always, and then people are trying to go out, move outside the box, so we can fulfill this like niche space. The online tarot community is actually really amazing, and because we come at business from a heart-centered space, most of us are spiritual, like many of us are like witchy people, or practice Zen Buddhism or whatever. Like the emphasis is not on competition. It's more so like there's enough for everybody, as long as we make sure that we're fulfilling different needs, kind of thing. So like we work together, and we try to be respectful of each other in that regard. But sometimes it just ends up that we're doing the same thing, and it reminds me, it's just that the ethereal idea space that we're all all of us pulling from a very similar space. So like it's bound to happen from time to time.
Yeah, I love that idea of that interconnectedness. I'm really wondering how you started your business and how it feels now to be working in something that you love and it seems like you feel really fulfilled by and feel like it's meaningful.
It is absolutely amazing. I am thankful for it and grateful for it every single day, even as it's challenging. I began reading tarot about 5 years ago. I began my study and my practice of it as someone who has like a literary and critical theory background. It just made a lot of sense. I was able to understand the archetypes pretty quickly, specifically because I'd already have this like extensive literary background. So I'm like, oh, that's that character, and not to create any misconceptions that learning tarot is easy, because it's not. Not at all. But I was able to make these connections, and honestly, it just reinforced that this is always what I wanted to be doing anyway, but like I just kind of missed the mark over the years. Like I always wanted to be able to help and to guide people through rough times, or even to help them create focus where there was none, so that they could work through the things they wanted to work through and become empowered. And one of the ways that I did that prior to anything woo or tarot was through reading books, through engaging with literature, through learning about characters and interactions and dynamics that way, and taking away the wisdom from text and novels that's just there to be taken. And so I decided that I was going to be an English teacher. And even after I had my training and then subsequently began tutoring privately, I realized that the conversations that were most rewarding for me and for the students that I was tutoring were those that had nothing to do with academics. When I really felt like my light turn on and I felt like I was actually making a difference was when we were discussing where they were right then in their lives, what sort of things they were dealing with, what kind of troubles they were facing, and how to move past that. And it was always something that I really wanted to engage with. And I never really wanted to do it in the psychology sense, because for me personally, it just seemed like there was this barrier, almost this wall that existed between, psychiatrist or psychologist and client, that would prevent me in the way that I do things from really engaging in the way that I personally thought was most useful.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking from me specifically, like my personality and how I approach things. For other people, doing psychiatry or psychology is absolutely going to be the most effective way that they can do that kind of work. So when I found tarot, I was just like, yes, this seems to be the way that I can be of most use, the way that I can use what I excel at most naturally and what I'm passionate about to actively help other people. And as soon as I made that realization and made that connection, it was kind of like full speed ahead. Like there was no stopping me. It's not like I quit my job and was like, I'm going to do this now, like without any like without any experience, without any business infrastructure, without any of that. It was more so like, I know this is going to be challenging and difficult. It's going to push me to do things that are difficult for me. It's going to push me to learn things that don't come naturally in order to have this function as a business. But I'm totally willing to go through all of that because it's worth it to be able to do this. And I think that that's the attitude that's really useful when it comes to starting your own business, because it is challenging, and that is an understatement. There's just, especially if you're going to be a solopreneur, if you're going to do the whole thing yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you have to wear so many hats, and you have to, fill in the gaps in your knowledge and your ability in order to make this thing work cohesively. Like I didn't have to spend that much time on, like perfecting my reading or, formatting the actual reading part. For that was the easy part for me. That was always the easy part. The most time I had to devote time to, social media exposure, creating, building a website, learning a little bit of code, just like learning how to create graphics to go along with my readings and go along with the website. Didn't know how to do any of that, just also having to put myself out there in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable, asking people, like you did to me, like asking people to come on live chats or come on to a podcast, asking someone if they'd want to host me teaching a workshop, and creating that kind of professional relationship. It is and it's always rewarding, but sometimes you will feel like you're putting so much work in. You're like, when is the fruit of my labor going to finally come? And you have to just continue to push through, hoping and knowing that it will come eventually. And this is honestly where the idea of just faith enters in. It's just faith in yourself and faith in your abilities and faith that if you keep plugging away, something will come of this. And, I'm not like an overtly religious person in this sense, but, I had to like really just have faith and trust that this would come to fruition. Because if I didn't have that trust in myself and trust that this would, become what it is, then I would have stopped a long time ago.
Yeah. When those moments of fear and having to learn something new and like, I have no idea how to make a website, things like that come up, how do you move past them? Is it that trust in yourself and that faith that things are going to work out and you're doing it for a reason?
It's partially that. And it's also knowing that this is what I want to do. It's almost like I make it like failure is not an option. And I know that sounds really hyperbolic, but it's just being willing to do some of the mundane work, being willing to get frustrated, being willing to have hours worth of work sometimes be deleted, because that's just going to happen sometimes. I don't care like how professional you are. I don't care like how organized you are and how on top of it you are. Like things like that will happen. And those are the watershed moments where, you're faced with, oh my gosh, I have to start this over completely from scratch. And if you can say yes, and do it completely from scratch again, and, ignore the frustration, and, just put all of those feelings aside and just be like, I'm doing it, then like you've actually kind of won half the battle. Because sometimes it does feel like you're Sisyphus pushing, the boulder up the mountain, like, and as soon
Mm-hmm.
as you get to the top, it gets pushed back down again. It's because also throughout an entrepreneurial journey or a business journey, you're going to reach peaks and plateaus. But as soon as you reach that space, you get, you're offered this opportunity to level up. And what that means is to, expand your business, increase your game. And as soon as you say yes to that, it's almost, you're not starting at square one, but it's like, here's another mountain that needs to be climbed. It's a never ending process. And you kind of have to fall in love with the process, just because, like anything else, you're never going to get to that, that halcyon field where like everything's perfect now, and everything's on autopilot, and you never have to do anything again, or you never have to be innovative, or you never have to be creative, or you never have to field any kind of issues or problems that are happening. Like that's part and parcel of the business journey. And if you can embrace that and just be excited about the process itself, then that can also be really, really helpful and really useful.
I feel like that's the perfect lead into what I want to talk about next, which is also a never-ending process, is shadow work.
Yes.
So obviously I was at your workshop, so I've learned a little bit about shadow work, but I'm hoping that you can just talk about what it is for people who might not know, and talk about your journey with it.
Sure. Okay. So, like, where do I begin? I know where. Shadow work. First, I'm going to address shadow, the term shadow. Shadow is a term that was first coined by Austrian psychologist Carl Gustav Jung around 1920. And he was a student of Freud, but they differed on some chief things, so he broke off and started his own school. And shadow is the aspect of your consciousness, or the aspect of your personality, or who you are, that is hidden in the subconscious. It is, their desires, shame, compulsions, all sorts of things that are stuffed down, either because you don't like them about it. There's things that you don't like about yourself. They're societally taboo, like they're just not respected or valued by the society you find yourself in, or that they're just so painful that you can't walk around with them. So you push them into a space of your consciousness, your subconscious, that you're unaware of. And all of us have, at least within this paradigm, all of us have a shadow side, a shadow element, aspects of our psyche that we're unaware of. And shadow work is the process of shining a light on those aspects, of getting in touch with your subconscious, so you can bring awareness to why you behave the way you do, why you're afraid of what you're afraid of, why you're shameful of what you're shameful of, and why you deny these aspects of your personality expression within yourself. And the goal or the purpose of doing this work is to bring those aspects or elements into the light, so that you can integrate them, so that you are aware of them, so that you can respond to them. Because when we keep things hidden in the shadow and we don't engage with them, they come out whether we want them to or not. And they often do during times of conflict, or during times of stress or duress. They'll come out within our interpersonal relationships, when you find yourself reacting to something that you don't even understand why you're reacting the way that you do, but you know that you have a heightened response, and you might even be overreacting, and you create a rift in a relationship, and then you're just like, what just happened? When you're really confused, it's usually because there's a shadow element at play there. And then when you bring awareness to that, what your triggers are, what people do or say, or the certain circumstances that exist that will trigger these feelings, these deep intense feelings of fear, shame, or sadness. And you can say, oh, okay, right now I am experiencing a shadow trigger. Someone just said something that made me feel like I was stupid. They didn't call me stupid. The reason why I'm getting, seeing red right now is because that one time when I was in third grade and I was shamed for a grade that I got in school, and I'm still carrying the shame and the feelings there, and I haven't worked through that. It just, bringing awareness to these things can put you back in the seat of your power. You then can determine how you react. You don't have to let your shadow speak for you and cause problems that you don't want to be caused.
Yeah, it's some intense work, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed it is. And I feel like I've been doing an aspect, a form of shadow work for a really long time, much longer than I had an awareness of the term shadow or the term shadow work. I was always trying to trace back my actions, my behaviors, my thoughts to something that had happened in the past. I also, before I even came to shadow work, I tried to see patterns in my relatives, and I tried to analyze how my grandparents had parented my parents and how they had responded to that, the things that they had, spurned, and the things that they carried with them as well, and how these were also aspects of trauma, or of certain social conditioning that they received at the hand of their parents. Or I always had an interest in that. And then when I came to the understanding of shadow and what shadow work was, that's when the real work began, because it was more conscious, it was more structured, it had an end goal in sight. I did it from a place of, again, of usefulness. So often before, I would do it and I would just feel hopeless. I'd look through, I'm like, oh, this is just how I am. This is how this person was, and like on and on and on. And that's just like a wound that's always going to be there. And well, that sucks. Shadow work makes it proactive. It says that it's okay that you had this experience. It's okay that you feel this way. Honestly, hold space for yourself for feeling this way, and you don't have to be perfect. And you can always ultimately control your destiny. Destiny is kind of a big word, but your path. And you don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. You don't have to be enslaved by these shadows that you've either been, gifted by your parents, or that have been created through your experiences. Like, you can, through bringing awareness to them, you can free yourself of the tyranny that they hold. And it doesn't mean that they'll disappear. It doesn't mean that, the pain still won't be there, but it just means you don't have to act as the agent of that pain, or as the agent of that trauma or that shame. That you can just say, I feel this way. I know why I feel this way. I understand, but I'm not going to act on behalf of that feeling.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so liberating to realize that you don't have to be controlled by all of these different things, and that you actually can work on them and change how you respond to them.
It's incredibly liberating. And, I've even seen, for me, it was completely transformative. It has absolutely changed my life. And that is not me exaggerating. I can tell you, if I didn't do shadow work, that I probably wouldn't have started my own business.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because so much of, I was always kind of afraid to put myself out there. I had this, this shadow, this perfection shadow, that everything had to be perfect. So, unless something was what I deemed perfect, I wouldn't let it go. I wouldn't put it out there. And it just held me back from so much. And, I realized that why everything needed to be perfect. It was a need for me to feel like I was in control, because I didn't always feel like I was in control. It was, a pressure that was placed on me to make sure that I delivered certain grades. It was, all of these elements. And I was just like, you know what, I actually can make the choice to be imperfect. And that was incredibly liberating, because I feel like many others who have, this need for perfectionism will hold themselves back from so much, and can almost even use it as like an excuse not to try new things, or not to put themselves out there. So, that just working through that made it possible for me to, publish a blog post with typos and be fine. Before, like 6 years ago, I would have been mortified that I put something out there that was grammatically incorrect. And now I'm just like, it's fine, because that's not what this is about. This post is not about the perfection of my grammar. It's about the message that's there, and the message is there regardless of how perfect the grammar is. So I just let it go. And that's what made it possible for me to start my own business. Was I had to be willing to make mistakes, because when you start your own business, mistakes will be made.
Yes, inevitable.
Inevitably, mistakes will be made. And, you can't, mistakes will be made, period. And I think it was also like a realization of like, it doesn't matter how perfect I try to make things or how long I wait till I, unleash something. Like, there's going to be flaws anyway. So it was like learning to live, integrating that shadow, like learning to live with my own flaws and my own shame over my flaws and all of that made this possible. So that's why I highly recommend shadow work. That's why I work with, I'll do shadow work tarot readings with clients. I offer a shadow work e-course. That is why I work with people, because I do believe fundamentally that it can help people push past these things that have been holding them back.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like the perfection trap is a huge one. And I know I've fallen into this so many times, and it's such a way to keep yourself small when you're like looking around and you're like, well, it's not going to be great, or like this person is already doing something that's perfect. So like I shouldn't put my thing out there. So yeah, I really love that you said that. And I'm wondering how, I know this is a huge topic again, but how you would recommend people get started with shadow work.
So one of the easiest ways you can begin getting started with shadow work, I mean, there's a couple methods that you can use. One of the ones that is just most easily, like automatically practical, I think, is to begin paying attention to when you have a heightened visceral reaction to things, like consciously paying attention, writing it down, recording it, just in day-to-day life. Like when were you most angry? When were you most annoyed? Just begin making a log of that, because like I said in the workshop, that sometimes people are assholes and that's just what's happening. Like sometimes someone says something nasty and you're upset because they were just being nasty, and there's no projection involved. Like there's nothing else involved. And that's just it. But it's important to pay attention to your reaction and whether or not it's an overreaction. So if someone says something like, hey hun, can you pick up some trash bags on your way home from work? And your immediate reaction is just like, well, fine, let me do everything for this house. Like that is an indication that there's definitely something more at play. And it could be like, a list of resentments that you have against this specific person, but chances are that your list of resentments find their onus in a shadow or two that you have lurking down there. So that's just a good way to begin, to start. And then, once you have that list, you can begin trying to trace it back to something that happened to you when you were younger that made a really, really huge impression. And I guess that brings me to my second tip of beginning shadow work. Go through your mental Rolodex and create a list of all of the most memorable, usually probably negatively memorable times that you have in your past, the ones that stick, the ones that keep cropping up, that time in the schoolyard where someone made fun of you, and like you're 35 and you're still thinking of that time. Like that's usually a huge indication that there's definitely something there that was formative. It had a huge impact. So if you create a list of all those big things, and then you can begin to journal around them, and you can do a free write, which is where you just kind of sit down and you have that topic in mind and you just write about it, whatever comes out. You can also do a free write when you're feeling that visceral anger or that I was speaking about earlier. You can withdraw and go do a free write then and just write your feelings and without censorship, just because you never know what's going to come out of that if you just let yourself write your feelings. But you can also do very conscious journaling, where you pick one of these events, these core formative events, and you create a list of journal prompts for yourself about these events. And then you actively respond to those journal prompts. That's another way to begin shadow work. Shadow work is a lot of self-reflection. It's a lot of journaling, honestly. It's just a lot of thinking and cogitating. And it's a lot of creating connections between behavior that we exhibit now and things that happened in the past that may have caused that behavior that we're experiencing now. So yes, the tips were create a list of all of the traumatic events that have happened in your past that you can't forget. Do some free write while you're viscerally angry. Free writing while you're viscerally angry. Also, you can do journal prompts that are very, very conscious. And there was one more that I'm forgetting right now. But I did definitely outline it, so it's there.
I have a question. When you say talk or do a free write when you're viscerally angry, does it always have to be anger? Can it sometimes be like a huge feeling of fear or like really sadness, something like that?
It can absolutely be those things. For some reason, anger is the one that I revert to, and I don't maybe gotta work that, but but yeah, it's basically just when you have an overwhelming feeling, and this could be of sadness, it could be of just pain, it could be of confusion, and like you said, it could be of fear. It's a feeling that takes you out of the present. It's so overwhelming and makes it hard for you to process any information that's coming in. That's a really good opportunity to do a free write. It's when you are feeling so emotional that you're having a hard time acting in consensus reality. And it usually means that the reason you're feeling so much, or these two are, they're linked. You're feeling so much because something is happening, something is going on there. And it's really good to do a free write during those times because you are completely vulnerable. And it's when you're overcome with this emotion that's not jubilant or joyful. You just almost feel like something's been cracked open within you. Get out the pen and the paper and write, because that's an opportunity for your subconscious to just come through. You're not blocking the channel because you can't, because you're feeling too much about something to censor it. So that's a really good opportunity to start writing, because you never know what's going to come out of that. Like, you can't really anticipate what things you're going to say. And I know personally, some of my free writes, I've done some epic free writes in my time, and I've surprised myself with the connections that I've made and the things that have come out of those free writes, and things that I would have thought were not even remotely related to what I was feeling. It's like this beautiful, and that's why a lot of shadow work, I try to reframe it positively, because it can be difficult. It can be, really challenging. It's a beautiful opportunity, even though you're feeling so intensely, to learn something about yourself. It's kind of trying to pull the silver lining from some of our less enjoyable experiences.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I'm just getting started with this, obviously, but I feel like there is nothing that feels better than that feeling when you just really feel cracked open and you've really gotten to something. Like, that feels so good.
It feels so good. Sometimes it can also feel like someone punched you in the face.
Okay, I haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, it feels so good when you come to a beautiful level of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I've had shadow work realizations that were just painful.
Mm-hmm.
And these are usually things specifically about myself. These are not, things that have happened to me, things that people have done to me. This is a realization of me in a certain situation, and honestly, the shitty thing that I have done.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that is, first, the shadow work journey is about what's happened to you. And this is a general, what I've seen and what I've experienced personally. It's not going to be this way for everyone. But usually shadow work, it begins with like what happened to you. You were the one acted upon. And then slowly but surely it transitions to a space where you realize that you are also someone's shadow, and that, things that you have done have had a huge impact on people that aren't necessarily positive. And then when you begin to realize that even when you're acting in good faith, that you're not necessarily doing right by this person because it's coming from an ego-driven place, those are the ones that, for me at least, are most challenging. And, you know, now I'm like married and I have a daughter. So like I have a partner who, you know, who my mere presence is an influence on him, because we work together and we spend so much time together. And, you know, through holding space for him and listening to him, I'm realizing how some of my natural approaches and how I would want people to approach me are not workable for this other person, are viewed in a different way. And those are the ones that have been most transformative, because that's empowering, because it's about you and about your behavior. And you're like, wow, this is coming from a shadow place in me. And it's maybe not coming from, you know, the pure and beautiful place that I thought it was coming from. And, you know, maybe it's time for me to take a look at how I approach other people and start to hold space for them and start to really see what it is they need, rather than projecting what I need onto them and approaching them as I would approach myself, because they're not me. That's where it starts to get really, really transformative, I think.
Yeah, actually something just started to come up for me, I think, while you started talking about that. So got to get busy later.
Oh, good. Yay.
Yeah. So I know you've talked about doing shadow work with tarot and astrology. You were talking about, I know, actually, I think I saw this on your blog, like a Mercury retrograde tarot spread. I'm wondering how you use all of these practices together and how they intersect for you.
So, as you know, as a practicing witch, I very much observe the phases of the moon. This is just something that naturally resonates with me. It's something that's always resonated with me. And that is a practice that I've chosen to adopt. The cool thing about witchcraft is that there are as many different practices as there are people practicing. You know, everyone does their own thing. That is something I've always been drawn to. And you know, it is a little bit of a mishmash, I have to say. And as far as integrating all of these things, sometimes I don't really integrate them. And I don't know why I decided to take it down this path, but I think I'm going to. Sometimes I leave them in their own space without necessarily tying them together. So like I will do, and maybe that's something I'll try to do in the future, who knows, but like Mercury retrograde is definitely something I have marked on my calendar. It's something that, you know, I latched onto, you know, through my own woo circles. And I just always really enjoyed the mythos around it. Like Mercury retrograde is such, like, you're not supposed to get married, don't buy a car, don't enter into a contract with anyone, you know, like, and there's all of these things around it. And I was just like, that is seriously wild. And there is, whether or not this is real, and this is the thing that I think I really enjoy about like woo spirituality, whether or not this is real objectively doesn't really matter. The fact that it's real to people and that people exist and their thoughts exist makes it real. So for some people, this will be something that happens. These are connections that are made. And I will do a spread or offer a Mercury retrograde reading, but I don't necessarily feel like I have to create the connection between that and psychology, for example, because like I did a blog post on how the chakra system, this is a connection, and how the chakra system relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's kind of, and that's a connection that I decided to draw. I guess the reason, or the way that they all coexist together, is through my identification as a witchy woo person and as an eclectic witch, someone who pulls from, you know, there's no bounds there as far as tradition is concerned. So, you know, I can incorporate psychology into my readings, which I do all the time, but then also incorporate I have crystal correspondences and incense that I burn during my readings because it works and because it feels good to make those connections. And I like the magical aspect and the logical aspect coexisting, because I think they actually do so more naturally than people think. I don't think they're as mutually exclusive as they're touted to be. I think that they can make pretty good bedfellows. And I think I just do that by just putting them side by side. I don't think I'm not creating any real theory behind it. really going out or seeking to prove that these two things are connected. I think I'm just actively connecting them, and it works somehow.
Yeah, I know you touched on this earlier about how witchcraft is different for everybody, and just now how there's many different practices as there are people. But I'm wondering, what does it mean to you specifically to be a witch? Like, what does that word mean to you?
To me, being a witch, it's a huge thing, but it's about personal sovereignty, very much
Mm.
so. It's about consciously setting intentions and trying to manifest those intentions. It's about dipping into the psyche and learning from it. It's about trying to understand the connection between, the inner world and the outer world. And it's understanding that there is fluidity in terms of the inner world and the outer world, that these two things are not separated, and that you can work with the energies within and in order to produce an effect without, and vice versa. There's actually a saying that's as within so without, as without so within, and it's a definitely a magical saying, and it really does draw the connection between who you are, as a magical being, or even as a being, and the world outside. And it tries to basically say that the two are the two are linked, that you can have an effect on the objective world just by existing, and likewise it can have an effect on you.
I love that so much. I think I'm going to leave it there with my last question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, which is, because the name of the show is Living Open, what does it mean to you to live openly?
Living openly means making myself vulnerable to be affected by my experiences, by the people that I interact with, by endeavoring to be as honest as I can with myself and with those around me, by living according to my personal ethics and my personal ethos, um, regardless of how I might be accepted or viewed by people outside of me. And it living openly invites criticism as well as love. It's not being afraid to, stand up for yourself and to stand up for someone else. It's not being afraid to do the right thing even when it's hard.
Can you tell everyone where they can follow along with you online, where they can contact you for a session?
Absolutely. I live online at www. I basically do live there half the time. I gotta
You
be
don't
honest.
live in Philly, you live
I
online.
live online as far as as far as being a tarot reader and a practitioner. I do live in Philly sometimes, but I mostly live online, and I live at www.jessihuntenburg.com. And that's the hub. I have a YouTube channel where I, talk about all things witchcraft and tarot. I have links to Facebook at that website, links to Twitter. I'm always posting. I post at least one blog post a week, endeavor to post 2 videos a week. And all of information as far as, booking your reading can be found on that website as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it as well. It was delightful.
I hope this episode inspires you to do some shadow work of your own. It definitely did for me, and it even made me think of some specific things that I know need to be shadow worked. So, come join me on the Facebook page, facebook.com/livingopen, to let me know what you thought. I'm also going to be doing a fun giveaway there in early January that I think you're all going to love. And I've been teaching a few live yoga classes and meditations there, which has been really fun. Next time a new episode comes out, it will be next year, which is completely insane. And I have some really exciting episodes coming up for you. One in particular that I am super pumped about, this amazing woman that I also met at Wanderlust, and she made me cry in front of a room of a bunch of people. She is just so amazing. So stay tuned for that. I will see you online until then, and talk to you in January.